The staff was already moving before I understood what I was looking at. It came down in a silver arc, heavy enough to crack a wall, fast enough that I barely tracked it with my own eyes, and it was aimed straight at the head of the new instructor, standing calm in the middle of the training yard. I remember thinking, in that one frozen second, that I was about to watch someone die on my first week at the academy. Then her hand came up. Not a block, not a dodge, just one open hand, rising without any hurry at all, and the staff stopped in her palm like it had hit a wall of solid stone. The sound of it was strange, a deep, dull thud that seemed to shake the ground under my boots. Dust lifted off the training mat in a soft ring around her feet. Nobody spoke, nobody breathed. For 3 long seconds, the only thing moving in that whole yard was a strand of her hair, drifting slowly back into place. My name is Reyes, and I am a cadet at the Coalition Officer Academy, the training ground where every rising species in known space sends its brightest young minds to become officers, strategists, and leaders. I am human, which at this academy has never meant very much. We are tolerated. We are useful for logistics and languages and diplomacy. Nobody at this school has ever looked at a human cadet and felt afraid. That was about to change, and I was standing close enough to watch it happen. The cadet holding the other end of the staff was named ThreatHFY, a member of the Vashtor line, bred over 10 generations for combat efficiency. 4 arms, plated skin, reflexes that could track a thrown blade out of the air. ThreatHFY was the top student in the entire advanced combat track, the kind of cadet other students stepped aside for in the hallway. Nobody had ever beaten ThreatHFY in a sparring match. Nobody had ever come close. ThreatHFY had swung that staff at full strength, the way you would swing at someone you did not respect. The way you swing when you expect no real defense at all, only to make a point about what humans are worth in a fight. And the point had failed, spectacularly, in front of 40 of the most talented young soldiers this galaxy has ever trained. The instructor's name was Elena Marsh. She had arrived at the academy only 3 weeks earlier, listed in our schedules as the teacher for something called Legacy Melee Systems, a mandatory elective that every cadet in my year treated as a joke. It was the one class where the workload was light and the grading was generous, mostly because nobody believed hand-to-hand combat mattered anymore in a galaxy full of energy shielding and long-range weapons. Most cadets used the hour to nap or review notes for harder subjects. I remember the first day she walked in. She was not tall. She did not look like someone who belonged on a battlefield. She wore the same gray training uniform as the rest of us. No rank markers, no decorations, nothing to suggest she had done anything remarkable in her life. She spoke quietly, gave short instructions, and never raised her voice even once. Several cadets from the Vashtor line had actually laughed when they saw her, quiet laughs behind closed mouths. The kind of laugh you give when you already know you are wasting your time. I did not laugh. I did not know why at the time. Something about the way she stood made me uneasy, though I could not explain what it was. She held herself like someone who had spent a long time learning to stay very still. For those 3 weeks, she taught us basic footwork, breathing patterns, and simple defensive stances. Nothing impressive, nothing that explained the tension I felt whenever she looked in my direction. The alien cadets grew bolder every session, treating the class like an extended break period, whispering jokes about human softness, about how the weakest species in the coalition had been given the job of teaching combat to species who could break steel with their bare hands. Then came the day of the demonstration. It happened because of a comment, a simple comment, made loud enough for the whole yard to hear, from ThreatHFY, standing with arms crossed near the equipment rack where the ceremonial breaching staffs were kept. These staffs were not ordinary training weapons. They were built from a dense alloy used in old boarding operations, heavy enough that only the strongest cadets could even lift one properly, let alone swing it with any real speed. Every staff came stamped with a force rating, a number showing exactly how much impact it could deliver at full swing. The number on the one ThreatHFY picked up that day was high enough to crack reinforced duracrete on a solid hit. ThreatHFY asked Instructor Marsh if she would like to demonstrate a proper defensive stance against a real strike, instead of just talking about footwork all week. The words were polite. The tone was not. Everyone in that yard understood the real question hiding underneath the polite one. The question was simple. Are you actually capable of anything, Or are humans just here to fill a seat? I expected her to decline. I expected her to redirect the lesson, the way any reasonable teacher would when a student challenges them in front of 40 onlookers. Instead, she set down the tablet she had been holding, walked calmly to the center of the yard, and said only one word: proceed. Threll's skin shifted color slightly, the way that species does when excitement runs high, and lifted the staff with 2 of its 4 arms, testing the weight, rolling its shoulders once. I remember glancing around at the other cadets. Nobody looked worried for Instructor Marsh. Several looked eager, the way you look forward to something you already expect to enjoy. I was the only one who noticed her breathing had not changed at all. Threll did not hold back. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that happened afterward. This was not a gentle test swing meant to show good form. This was a full strike, delivered with every bit of trained strength that species possesses, aimed directly at the side of her head. If that staff had connected the way it was meant to connect, Instructor Marsh would have been carried out of that yard on a stretcher, and nobody watching would have been surprised. The staff never got there. Her hand rose without any wasted movement, fingers open, palm forward, and she caught the falling weight of that alloy staff in one grip, stopping it dead in the air less than a hand's width from her own temple. The impact should have driven her backward. It should have knocked her off her feet at the very least. Instead, her stance did not shift by more than an inch. The staff simply stopped, as if it had struck an invisible wall built specifically to hold it. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced. Threll's eyes had gone wide, 4 arms still gripping the staff, muscles straining as it tried, and failed, to pull the weapon free from her single hand. I watched the color drain from patches of its skin, the telltale sign of shock in that species, a reaction that cannot be faked or hidden. Around the yard, I heard sounds I had never heard alien cadets make before. A sharp intake of breath from a Corvani cadet near the fence. The clicking of mandibles from 2 Katrasi students, a sound their species makes only when genuinely startled. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered a single word in a language I did not recognize, but the tone needed no translation. It was fear. Instructor Marsh looked at Threll with an expression that held no anger and no pride. She simply asked, in the same quiet voice she used every single day in class, whether Threll wanted to try again. Nobody answered. Threll released the staff and stepped back, and for the first time since I had arrived at this academy, I watched an elite cadet from the strongest combat line in the coalition look genuinely uncertain about what to do next. I want to try to explain why this mattered so much, because from the outside it might sound like a simple trick, a strong grip, nothing more. It was not that. Every cadet standing in that yard had trained since childhood to understand exactly what forces their bodies could withstand and exactly what forces could break them. We are taught the numbers. We are taught the physics. A strike from that particular staff, delivered by a cadet of Threll's rank and species, was calculated to exceed what any unarmored human body should be able to absorb through a single limb. Not survive. Absorb, cleanly, without so much as a stumble. The math did not work. And yet there she stood, hand still raised slightly, as if she had simply caught a ball tossed by a child. I remember looking at my own hands afterward, turning them over, wondering what exactly a human body was supposed to be capable of, because everything I had been taught at this academy suggested the answer was very little compared to the other species around us. We were the newest members of the coalition, admitted only after a long and cautious screening process that none of us fully understood. Older cadets sometimes joked that humans had been kept out of galactic society longer than any other known species, and none of the alien instructors ever explained exactly why. I had always assumed it was simple bureaucracy, distance, the slow pace of first contact protocols. Standing in that yard, watching Threll step back from a woman who had not even needed to move her feet, I began to wonder if the real reason was something else entirely. Class ended early that day. Nobody discussed footwork. Nobody reviewed breathing patterns. Instructor Marsh gathered the training staffs, returned them to the rack with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything, and dismissed us without another word about what had happened. She did not look proud. She did not look satisfied. If anything, she looked faintly tired, the way you look after finishing a task you had hoped to avoid. I walked back to the barracks in silence. surrounded by cadets who usually could not stop talking. Nobody laughed that evening. Nobody made jokes about human softness. The mess hall that night was quieter than I had ever heard it. 40 of the Academy's best combat cadets picking at their food, glancing occasionally toward the door as if Instructor Marsh might walk through it at any moment. By the time the lights dimmed for evening hours, word had already spread through every barracks on the base. I did not know yet that somewhere across campus, cadets were already pulling up their personal terminals, opening transfer request forms, staring at blank fields where they were supposed to explain their reasons for wanting to change instructors or programs. I did not know yet that by morning, 40 of those requests would land on the commandant's desk, all filed within the same single night, all connected in some way to one quiet woman who had caught a weapon with her bare hand and asked, calmly, if anyone wanted to try again. All I knew, standing outside the barracks under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, was that everything I thought I understood about my own species was about to be proven wrong. The Academy had a rule that every cadet learned within the first week of arrival. Footage from training yards was never released publicly and never shown outside official review boards, because combat drills sometimes ended in injuries that families back home did not need to see. That rule lasted exactly one night after Instructor Marsh caught that staff. By the time I woke the next morning, half the barracks had already seen the recording. Nobody knew who had leaked it, though I suspected one of the maintenance drones that swept the yard had an internal camera nobody thought to check. It did not matter how it happened. What mattered was that a 9-second clip of a human woman stopping a full-strength strike with one hand was now circulating through every terminal on campus, replayed so many times that the Academy's internal network actually slowed down under the traffic. I watched it 7 times myself before breakfast. Each time, I searched for some trick, some hidden detail that would explain what I had seen with my own eyes the day before. A support brace under her sleeve, a modified glove, some kind of personal shield generator tucked into her uniform. I found nothing. The recording showed exactly what I remembered, no more and no less. One hand, one moment. A strike rated to shatter reinforced material, stopped as if it were nothing at all. The mess hall that morning felt different from any morning before it. Usually the room buzzed with overlapping conversations in a dozen languages, cadets arguing about assignments, comparing scores, complaining about instructors. That morning, most tables sat quiet, cadets eating with their eyes fixed on their trays, occasionally glancing toward the entrance as if Instructor Marsh might walk in and they needed to be ready for it. Threll was not at breakfast at all. I noticed the empty seat at the Vashtor table, the first time all semester that seat had gone unfilled. Rumors moved quickly in a place like this, and by the time I reached my first class, I had already heard 3 different versions of what supposedly happened after the demonstration. One version claimed Threll had gone to the medical wing with a fractured arm, which I knew to be false since I had watched the entire exchange and no injury had occurred at all. Another claimed Threll had requested an emergency meeting with the commandant. A third, quieter version, whispered mostly by cadets who avoided eye contact while saying it, suggested that Threll had simply not been able to sleep, replaying that single moment over and over, trying to understand how a species considered soft by every measurement Threll's people used could stop a strike meant to end a fight in half a second. I found out later that the third rumor was the closest to true. My first class that day was tactical theory, taught by an older Corvani instructor, who rarely commented on anything outside the assigned material. Even he could not help himself. Before starting the lesson, he paused, looked around the room at 40 distracted faces, and asked simply whether anyone wanted to explain why half his class looked like they had seen a ghost. Nobody answered. He shook his head, muttered something in his own language that I did not catch, and began the lesson as if nothing unusual had happened. It was during the break between classes that Threll finally found me. I want to explain something about the social structure at this academy, because it matters for what happened next. Species did not typically mix during free periods. Not out of hostility, but out of simple habit, the same way people anywhere tend to sit with those they already understand best. Humans sat with humans. The Vashtor line sat together, as did the Corvani, the Catrasi, and every other species represented in our year. In 3 weeks, Threll had never once spoken directly to me, despite us sharing 4 separate classes. That changed the moment Threll appeared beside my table in the courtyard, 4 arms crossed, expression unreadable beneath plated skin that had not fully returned to its normal color since the day before. Threll asked if all humans were capable of what Instructor Marsh had done. I told the truth, because I did not know how to answer any other way. I said I honestly did not know. I explained that I had never seen anything like that before either, that Instructor Marsh's file listed nothing unusual, that as far as any of us knew, she was simply another instructor assigned to teach an elective nobody took seriously. I admitted that watching that demonstration had left me with more questions about my own species than answers. Threll studied me for a long moment, the kind of long silence that made me want to look away, though I forced myself not to. Then Threll said something I did not expect. Threll said that in 3 generations of combat training, in a bloodline specifically engineered across 10 generations to produce the strongest fighters the Vashtor people could create, nothing had ever prepared Threll for the idea that strength like that could exist and go completely unmentioned, unrecorded, treated as ordinary enough to be assigned to teach a beginner elective. I asked Threll what that meant. Threll's answer stayed with me for a long time afterward. Threll said that when a species builds its warriors on purpose, breeding for strength across generations, that species learns to measure exactly how strong its strongest members can become. There is always a ceiling. Every species has one. A known limit built from biology and training and time. What Threll had witnessed the day before did not fit inside any known ceiling. It suggested either that Instructor Marsh was an extraordinary outlier even among her own kind, or that human strength as a species had never actually been measured properly at all, and every assumption made about humans since first contact had been built on incomplete information. I did not have an answer for that. I still do not fully have one, even now, looking back on everything that followed. The rest of that day passed in a strange kind of tension, the sort that builds slowly rather than arriving all at once. Every hallway conversation seemed to circle back to the same subject, even when cadets tried to talk about something else. I overheard 2 Catresi students debating whether the strength displayed in the footage was physical at all, or whether some kind of technology had been involved that their sensors simply failed to detect. I overheard a group of junior officers, cadets 1 year ahead of us, discussing whether Instructor Marsh's assignment to teach a beginner elective had been some kind of deliberate placement, a way of hiding something in plain sight until the right moment arrived to reveal it. I did not attend Legacy Melee Systems that afternoon expecting anything unusual. If anything, I expected the opposite, a quiet class, perhaps a brief acknowledgement of what had happened the day before, followed by a return to footwork drills and breathing exercises. Instead, I arrived to find the training yard already full, every seat taken, cadets from other tracks and other years crowded along the fence line who had no reason to be there at all except curiosity. Instructor Marsh arrived exactly on time, as she always did, carrying the same tablet she always carried, wearing the same gray uniform without any markers of rank or achievement. She looked out at the crowd gathered along the fence, then back at her actual roster of enrolled cadets, and said nothing about the extra attendance at all. She simply began the lesson as though the yard held 40 students instead of 80. That restraint told me something important, something I only understood fully much later. She was not interested in the attention. She had not caught that staff to prove a point, or to build a reputation, or to enjoy the reaction of a crowd. Whatever had happened the day before had been, to her, simply a response to a strike that needed to be answered, nothing more. Near the end of that class, Threll approached her directly, in front of everyone, and asked a question that silenced the entire yard within seconds. Threll asked if Instructor Marsh would be willing to explain her service history, since the Academy records showed almost nothing beyond her current teaching assignment. Instructor Marsh set down her tablet, the same calm gesture she had used the day before, and looked at Threll for a long moment before answering. She said that her history was not a secret, but it also was not something she discussed casually in a training yard, because certain things are better understood through actions than through stories told after the fact. She said that if Threll wanted answers, Threll was welcome to submit a formal request through proper channels, and she would not object to whatever the Commandant decided to share. It was a careful answer, giving nothing away and refusing nothing outright. I remember thinking, at the time, that it sounded like the kind of answer someone gives when the truth behind it is larger than a single conversation could hold. Within an hour of that class ending, I heard that Threll had done exactly what Instructor Marsh suggested, walking directly to the administration building and requesting a formal review of her service record. I heard that 2 other Vashtor cadets had joined that request before the end of the day. By evening, the number had grown. Cadets from species across the entire academy submitting the same request through the same channel, all asking the same basic question: who is this woman, and what exactly is she capable of? I submitted no such request myself that day, though I thought about it more than once. Something told me the answer, whatever it turned out to be, was not going to arrive through paperwork. It was going to arrive the way everything else had arrived so far, quietly, without warning, in a moment none of us would see coming until it had already happened. That evening, walking back from the mess hall under a sky thick with unfamiliar constellations, I passed the administration building and noticed a light still burning in the commandant's office window, far later than the usual hour for that kind of activity. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed it was simply late paperwork, perhaps related to the sudden flood of formal requests filed that day. I did not know yet that inside that lit office, a decision was already being made about how much of Instructor Marsh's history could safely be shared with a room full of cadets who had no idea what they were truly asking to learn. I did not know that within 2 days, I would be standing inside that very office myself, called in not as a witness to a fight, but as a translator for a conversation that would change how every species at this academy understood the word human. The next 2 days felt unlike any stretch of time I had experienced since arriving at the academy. Classes continued on schedule, assignments were still due, and instructors still expected work completed on time, yet everything underneath that routine had shifted in a way I found difficult to describe to anyone who had not been standing in that yard when it happened. Cadets began testing theories in quiet corners of the barracks. I overheard a pair of Corvani students running calculations on a shared tablet, trying to work out how much force a human forearm could theoretically absorb if trained properly from childhood. Their numbers kept changing because their starting assumptions kept changing, and at one point one of them admitted, quietly, that the entire model depended on data nobody at this academy actually had. Human physical limits, it turned out, had never been formally tested by the Coalition's own scientific bodies. We had been accepted as members, given seats in this academy, assigned duties across various fleets and outposts, yet somehow the most basic question about what a human body could withstand under stress had simply never been answered in any official record. I found that strange the first time I heard it mentioned. By the second day, I found it unsettling. A cadet named Priya, one of the few other humans in my year, cornered me outside the library on the second evening and asked if I had noticed the same thing she had noticed. She said that ever since the demonstration, the alien cadets in her study group had started treating her differently, not with more hostility, but with a kind of careful distance, the way you might treat a device you were told was perfectly safe, right up until you watched it do something none of the manuals mentioned. She said one of her lab partners, a Katrasi student she had worked alongside for the entire semester, had started arriving early to sit somewhere else in the room, never explaining why, never meeting her eyes when she asked if something was wrong. I told her I had noticed something similar. Cadets who used to joke freely with me in the corridors now measured their words more carefully, not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of cautious respect that had not existed a week earlier. It was a strange thing to sit with. For my entire time at this academy, being human had meant being underestimated, assumed capable of administrative work and diplomacy, but little else in the way of physical achievement. Now, seemingly overnight, that same fact had become something other cadets were quietly recalculating. On the third morning after the demonstration, something happened that pushed the entire situation past simple rumor and into something the academy could no longer treat as a passing curiosity. It happened during a joint training exercise, one of the mixed drills where cadets from different specialties practiced coordinated response scenarios. A younger cadet, barely into his first year, made a mistake during a simulated pressure test, misjudging the strength setting on a resistance drone used to train defensive reflexes. The drone, built to simulate combat-level force for advanced cadets, activated at full setting instead of the reduced beginner setting, and swung its padded arm directly at the young cadet's head before anyone could stop it. I was not present for this incident myself, but I heard the account from at least 6 different cadets over the following days, and every version matched closely enough that I trusted as accurate. Instructor Marsh was walking past that particular drill yard at the exact moment the malfunction occurred. She was not assigned to that exercise. She was simply passing through on her way to another building. According to every witness, she crossed the distance between herself and that drone faster than anyone could clearly track, catching the drone's padded arm inches from the young cadet's skull, holding it there with one hand while reaching over with the other to manually shut down its power core. The whole event lasted under 2 seconds. The young cadet walked away without a scratch. Instructor Marsh checked that he was steady on his feet, confirmed he was unharmed, and then continued on her way to wherever she had originally been headed, as if catching a malfunctioning combat drone mid-swing was simply part of an ordinary afternoon. That second incident spread through the academy even faster than the first. It was one thing to catch a weapon during a controlled demonstration, where the timing was known and the strike expected. It was another thing entirely to react instantly to an unexpected malfunction, crossing open ground and stopping a strike with barely a moment's warning. Cadets who had spent 2 days debating whether the first event might have been some kind of prepared trick could no longer hold on to that theory. There had been no preparation possible for a malfunction nobody predicted. I remember sitting in the mess hall that evening, listening to a table of senior cadets debate the implications in low, careful voices. One of them, a Corvani cadet nearing graduation, said something that stuck with me. He said that in all his years at this academy, watching instructors from a dozen different species demonstrate their specialties, he had never once seen anyone move the way she moved. Not faster in the way a trained body moves faster through practice and repetition, but faster in a way that suggested her body was simply built, or trained, on an entirely different scale than anything the rest of us had encountered. Another cadet at that table, a Catrasi student known for skepticism, pushed back gently, suggesting that perhaps this was simply one extraordinary individual, not representative of humans as a whole. I remember the Corvani cadet's response clearly, because it echoed something Threll had said to me days earlier. He said that even one extraordinary individual raised uncomfortable questions, because the coalition had accepted humanity as members only after a long screening period, longer than any other species in living memory, and nobody outside the highest levels of command had ever been told exactly why that screening period had taken so long. I had heard that detail mentioned before, in passing, during history lectures that moved quickly past the topic without dwelling on it. Humanity's entry into the coalition had been delayed, cautious, treated with a level of care not extended to other emerging species. I had always assumed this was simply bureaucratic caution, the kind of slow process that governs any large organization dealing with something new. Sitting in that mess hall, listening to cadets far more experienced than myself speculate about what Instructor Marsh's abilities might mean for that history, I began to wonder if the delay had never been about bureaucracy at all. Threll found me again the following afternoon, this time not alone, but accompanied by 2 other Vashtor cadets I recognized from the advanced combat track. All 3 looked as though they had slept poorly, a detail I recognized easily since I had not been sleeping particularly well myself. Threll explained that the formal request for Instructor Marsh's service history had been received by administration, but had come back with most of the relevant details restricted under a classification level none of us had clearance to view. This was, apparently, unusual. Cadets occasionally saw restricted notices on certain files, records tied to ongoing operations or sensitive diplomatic matters, but a teaching instructor's personal service history being classified at that level was almost unheard of. One of the other Vashtor cadets, a quiet student who rarely spoke in group settings, asked me directly whether humans classified information about their own soldiers this way normally, whether this was some kind of cultural practice unique to our species. I told them honestly that I did not know, that my own knowledge of human military history from before the coalition period was limited to what appeared in General Academy coursework, which itself was surprisingly thin compared to the detailed histories taught about other founding member species. That admission seemed to unsettle them more than any answer I could have given. Threll pointed out, quite reasonably, that most species entering the coalition arrived with detailed historical records, decades or centuries of documented conflicts and achievements that helped other species understand exactly what that species was capable of and how they had gotten there. Humanity's records, by comparison, felt thin in exactly the areas that mattered most for understanding our physical and tactical capabilities. Diplomatic history was well documented. Cultural history was well documented. Military history from the period before formal coalition contact was, strangely, presented only in broad strokes, without the kind of detail given to other species. I did not have an answer for why that was true. I still do not fully understand it, even now, though I understand it far better than I did that afternoon. That evening, an announcement appeared on the General Academy board, the kind of notice that rarely drew much attention since most of them concerned scheduling changes or facility maintenance. This one was different. It stated simply that Instructor Marsh was requested to appear before the Commandant's office the following morning for a scheduled review, and that any cadet with direct knowledge relevant to recent training incidents involving her should also report for a preliminary statement. My name appeared on that list, along with ThreatHFY's and 4 other cadets who had been present for either the staff demonstration or the drone incident. I did not sleep well that night, running through everything I had seen over the past several days, trying to organize it into something coherent enough to explain to a commandant who likely already understood more about the situation than any of us. I kept returning to one detail that had stayed lodged in my mind since the very first moment, the way Instructor Marsh had looked after catching that staff. Not proud, not surprised at her own ability. Simply calm, the way someone looks when a question they have been asked before finally gets answered again, in the same way it always gets answered, whether they wanted it to or not. I arrived outside the administration building the next morning, earlier than required, standing in the cool air with 4 other cadets, who looked as uncertain as I felt. ThreatHFY stood slightly apart from the group, arms crossed, staring at the closed door as though trying to decide whether walking through it would answer more questions than it raised, or simply create new ones we were not prepared to handle. None of us spoke while we waited. When the door finally opened and a junior officer called us inside, I remember thinking that whatever we were about to hear, it was going to change how every cadet in this academy understood the word human, myself included. I had no idea, standing in that hallway, just how right that thought was about to prove. The Commandant's office was smaller than I expected, given how much authority moved through it. A wide window looked out over the training yards below, and behind a plain metal desk sat Commandant Adrian Voss, a broad-shouldered officer who had served the coalition for longer than most of us had been alive. He did not look up immediately when we entered, still reading something on the display in front of him, and I remember noticing that his expression carried none of the curiosity that had spread through the rest of the academy over the past few days. He looked instead like someone who already knew the answer to a question everyone else was still asking. Instructor Marsh stood near the window when we arrived, hands folded in front of her, the same calm posture she carried into every class. She glanced at each of us as we filed in, and when her eyes reached mine, I felt something I had not expected. Not intimidation, but a strange kind of recognition, as though she understood exactly why a room full of cadets had been called together and felt no need to make the moment more dramatic than it already was. The Commandant finally looked up and addressed the room directly. He said that in the past several days, the Academy had received an unusual number of formal requests, review petitions, and informal inquiries, all connected to 2 specific incidents involving Instructor Marsh. He said that under normal circumstances, an instructor's personal service history remained private unless that instructor chose to share it. However, given the scale of interest and the disruption it had caused across multiple cadet cohorts, he had decided that a limited explanation would serve the Academy better than continued speculation. He turned to Instructor Marsh and asked, simply, whether she was comfortable with a summary of her record being shared with those present. She said yes, though she added that a summary would only ever be a summary and that numbers on a page rarely explain the full weight of what they represent. The Commandant nodded, as though this were an answer he had heard from her before, and turned his display toward the room. I want to describe carefully what appeared on that screen, because I have thought about it many times since that morning, and I still find certain parts of it difficult to fully absorb. The record confirmed she had served during a period of conflict that predated the current era of coalition peace, a period referenced only briefly in our standard history courses as the unification conflicts, a stretch of time when Earth's nations, still divided and still recovering from centuries of instability, faced a threat that nearly ended human civilization before the coalition ever made contact. Our coursework mentioned this period only in passing, framing it as an internal matter resolved before first contact occurred, never explaining what exactly humanity had faced or how narrowly it had survived. The Commandant explained, in a measured voice, that the details of that conflict remained restricted at a level above cadet clearance, and would likely remain that way for reasons connected to ongoing diplomatic sensitivities between the coalition and several founding species. What he could share was this. Instructor Marsh had not been selected for that conflict because she was the strongest soldier available. She had been selected because she was among a small group trained specifically for situations where a conflict needed to end quickly, with minimal further loss, regardless of what that ending required of the individual carrying it out. He said that humanity's long screening period before formal coalition admission had never been about bureaucracy, as many cadets had assumed over the years. It had been about caution, extended out of respect for what human military records from that period suggested about human capability once fully mobilized. The coalition, he explained, had taken its time before formally welcoming humanity as members, not because they doubted our worth, but because they understood, from a distance, exactly what kind of species they were choosing to invite into a shared galactic community, and wanted to be certain that invitation was extended with full awareness of the responsibility it carried on both sides. Threll asked, quietly, whether that meant every human possessed the same capability Instructor Marsh had displayed in the training yard. The Commandant answered carefully. He said that individual capability varied enormously among humans, just as it varied among every species in the coalition, and that Instructor Marsh represented a specific outcome of specific training, not a baseline expectation for the species as a whole. What her record did suggest, however, was that the upper limits of human capability, when deliberately trained and tested under extreme circumstance, extended further than the coalition's general assumptions had accounted for. The reason this mattered, he explained, was not the specific number attached to her strength or her speed, but the fact that an entire species had entered this academy for years without anyone bothering to properly measure where those true limits actually sat. Instructor Marsh spoke for the first time since we had entered the room. She said that the reason she had chosen to demonstrate rather than explain, when Threll challenged her in the training yard days earlier, was simple. Words invite argument. A demonstration does not. She said she had not caught that staff to embarrass anyone, or to prove humanity's worth through a single dramatic gesture. She had done it because a full-strength strike had been aimed at her head by a cadet who genuinely believed it would land without consequence, and allowing that assumption to continue unchallenged would have been more dangerous, in the long run, than correcting it immediately. She added something I have carried with me ever since. She said that the most important part of what happened in that yard was not the catch itself, it was what came after. She had not broken Threll's arm, though she explained plainly that she could have, easily, given the difference in force between the strike and her response. She had chosen instead to simply stop the strike and ask a quiet question. That choice, she said, mattered more than the strength behind it, because strength without control is simply another kind of danger, and an academy meant to train future officers needed to understand that difference clearly, especially now that humanity's true capability had become impossible to ignore. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking. I found myself thinking about every human cadet I had watched get dismissed in hallway conversations over the past several months, every quiet joke made at our expense about being the soft, administrative species tucked in among far more physically capable neighbors. I thought about how none of us, myself included, had ever pushed back against that assumption, because we ourselves had never been given any reason to question it. The Commandant closed the file and addressed the room one final time. He said that Instructor Marsh would remain assigned to teach legacy melee systems for the remainder of the term, and that her methods, whatever they turned out to involve going forward, had his full support. He added, almost as an afterthought, that given the volume of inquiries already flooding the administration office regarding future enrollment in her classes, the Academy would likely need to expand her course offerings the following term to accommodate demand. I did not fully understand what he meant by that until later in the day, when I learned exactly how many transfer requests had already been filed since the staff incident occurred. Before we were dismissed, Threll asked one final question, quieter than the others, almost hesitant in a way I had never heard from Threll before. Threll asked Instructor Marsh directly whether she had been afraid, even for a moment, during the demonstration, knowing the force behind the strike aimed at her. She considered the question for a moment before answering. She said that fear was not really the right word for what she felt in moments like that. She said that after enough time spent in situations where split-second decisions carried real consequences, the mind stops experiencing fear the way it once did, and instead settles into a kind of quiet focus, a narrowing of attention onto exactly what needs to happen next. She said she hoped none of us would ever need to develop that kind of focus the way she had, and that the entire purpose of teaching a class like Legacy Melee Systems was to help cadets learn control and awareness long before circumstances ever forced the lesson on them the hard way. Walking out of that office afterward, I felt the weight of everything I had just heard settle slowly over me, the way understanding sometimes arrives, not all at once, but in layers, each one changing how the layer before it looked in hindsight. I thought about the delayed screening period before humanity joined the coalition, a detail I had always dismissed as bureaucratic caution. I thought about the strangely thin military records from before coalition contact, records I had assumed were simply incomplete rather than deliberately limited. I thought about Instructor Marsh's calm, unreadable expression on the very first day of class, and understood now, finally, exactly what that stillness had been hiding the entire time. Threll walked beside me for part of the way back toward the barracks, quieter than I had ever known that cadet to be. Eventually Threll spoke, almost to itself rather than to me, saying that in 10 generations of engineered strength, in a bloodline built specifically to produce the finest warriors the Vashtor people could create, nothing in that entire lineage had prepared Threll to understand what it meant that an entire species like humanity had been quietly capable of something like this the whole time, tucked away behind polite smiles and administrative duties, never once needing to prove it until circumstances finally demanded otherwise. I did not have a response for that. I simply nodded, and we walked the rest of the way in silence, each of us carrying our own version of the same realization. That evening, I checked the Academy's internal network out of habit, more than curiosity, and found the number I had been hearing whispered about all day, finally confirmed in an official administrative memo. 40 separate transfer requests had been filed since the previous evening, each one requesting placement in Instructor Marsh's future course sections, regardless of specialty track or species. Cadets who had never shown any interest in melee training before that week were now requesting priority enrollment. Cadets from the most elite combat lineages in the coalition, cadets who had spent their entire lives being told they stood among the strongest fighters this galaxy had ever produced, were asking to be taught by a quiet human woman who had, until 1 week earlier, been considered too unremarkable to draw any attention at all. I sat with that memo for a long time that night, thinking about what it truly meant, and slowly realized that the story spreading through the Academy had never really been about fear at all. It had been about respect, earned in a single deliberate moment, by someone who had every reason to make a bigger show of what she was capable of, and chose instead to simply answer a question quietly, and then return to teaching as though nothing unusual had happened. I did not yet know that my own understanding of that lesson was still incomplete, or that the following day would bring Instructor Marsh's own explanation of why she had chosen restraint over force, delivered not in an office to a handful of cadets, but in front of the entire training yard, to every single student who now waited to hear what she would say next. The training yard the next morning looked different than I had ever seen it, and not because anything about the physical space had changed. The same worn mats covered the ground, the same equipment racks lined the far wall, the same morning light spread across the dust kicked up by early arrivals. What had changed was the number of people standing inside it. Word had spread overnight that Instructor Marsh intended to address the entire cadet body, not just her small roster of enrolled students, and by the time I arrived, cadets from every specialty track, every species, every year of study had gathered along the fences and spilled into the open field itself. I found a spot near the front, close enough to see her clearly when she finally walked out from the equipment building, carrying no tablet this time, no notes, nothing but her own quiet presence, and the same gray uniform she had worn every day since arriving at this academy. She stopped near the center of the yard, the same spot where she had caught that staff less than a week earlier, and waited for the crowd to settle into silence on its own, without needing to ask for it. I remember looking around at the faces gathered there. Threll stood near the front alongside the other Vashtor cadets, expression steady, but attentive in a way I had not seen before that week. Priya stood near me, arms crossed, watching closely. Even instructors from other departments had gathered along the edges of the yard, curious enough to set aside their usual schedules for this. Instructor Marsh began speaking without any introduction, her voice carrying easily across the quiet crowd despite its usual softness. She said she understood that the past week had raised more questions than her classes usually generated, and that she did not intend to leave those questions completely unanswered, though she would not attempt to answer all of them either, since some answers belonged to history rather than to a single morning in a training yard. She said that many cadets had spent the week trying to understand what she was capable of, measuring her against known limits, searching for explanations that fit neatly into existing categories. She said she understood that impulse, because it was the same impulse that had shaped how the wider coalition once approached humanity as a whole, cautiously, at a distance, trying to measure an unfamiliar species against categories built from prior experience with other species entirely. She said that humanity's long road to coalition membership had never been about doubt regarding our worth. It had been about care, extended by an alliance that understood, even from a great distance, that inviting a species capable of what humanity had shown itself capable of during its most difficult era required more than simple paperwork. It required trust, built slowly, in both directions, because power without trust becomes dangerous regardless of which species happens to hold it. She said that the demonstration in this very yard, days earlier, had not been about proving human strength to anyone who doubted it. She said proving strength was easy and ultimately meaningless on its own. What mattered far more, she explained, was what a person chose to do with that strength once it had been proven. She reminded the crowd that she had stopped that strike cleanly, without injury, without retaliation, and without any attempt to humiliate the cadet who delivered it. She said that choice, made in less than a second, mattered more to her than the strike itself, because an officer who cannot control the force available to them is far more dangerous than an officer who has none at all. She looked, at that point, directly at Threll and said that she held no resentment for the challenge issued that day. She understood exactly why it had happened, the same way she understood why cadets across the academy had spent the past week reconsidering long-held assumptions about an entire species based on 9 seconds of footage. She said assumptions, once challenged, deserved to be examined honestly rather than defended out of habit, and she respected any cadet, of any species, willing to do that examining rather than simply dismissing what they had seen. She then addressed something I had not expected her to raise at all. She spoke briefly, carefully, about the conflict referenced in her service record, the unification era that predated coalition contact, without going into details clearly still restricted at levels above our clearance. She said only that humanity had come dangerously close to losing everything during that period, not from an external threat, but from its own internal divisions, and that the lesson learned from surviving that era had shaped how seriously humanity now approached the responsibility that came with real strength. She said that lesson was the entire reason legacy melee systems existed as a course at all, not to teach cadets how to fight, but to teach them how to recognize the weight of the force available to them, and how to carry that weight without letting it define who they became. She said she hoped every cadet standing in that yard, human and otherwise, would leave this week with a better understanding not of what humanity was capable of, but of what any species becomes capable of once it learns to pair real strength with real restraint. She said that lesson mattered more, in her experience, than any single number attached to a training staff's rated force or any record buried in a classified file somewhere in the administration building. When she finished speaking, the yard remained quiet for a long moment, the same kind of quiet that had followed the original demonstration, though this time it did not feel like shock. It felt like something settling into place. An understanding reached collectively by several hundred cadets standing shoulder to shoulder in the morning light. Threll was the first to step forward from the crowd. Threll said, in a voice loud enough for the surrounding cadets to hear clearly, that the request submitted to administration the day before, along with dozens of others just like it, had not been born from fear the way some cadets outside our year group had assumed when the story first began circulating. Threll said the requests had been born from something closer to respect, a recognition that whatever instructor Marsh had to teach was worth far more than the light workload elective her class had originally been treated as. Instructor Marsh accepted that with a small nod, nothing dramatic, no visible pride, simply the same calm acknowledgement she carried through everything else that week. I walked away from that yard that morning carrying a different understanding of my own place at this academy than I had carried the week before. I had arrived at this school assuming humanity's role among the Coalition's founding species was a quiet, supportive one, useful but unremarkable, tolerated more than respected. Watching that week unfold had shown me something else entirely. Not that humans were secretly the strongest species in the galaxy, because Instructor Marsh herself had been careful never to claim that, but that strength existed in places nobody had thought to look for it, waiting quietly until circumstances finally called it forward. That evening, I opened my own terminal and stared for a long time at the enrollment page for the following term's course offerings. Legacy Melee Systems appeared near the top of the list now, its enrollment cap raised significantly to accommodate the flood of new interest, taught by the same instructor who had spent her first 3 weeks at this academy going almost entirely unnoticed. I submitted my own request that night, not out of fear of what I had witnessed, and not out of any need to prove something to the cadets around me. I submitted it because for the first time since arriving at this academy, I wanted to understand what my own species had quietly been capable of the entire time, held back not by weakness, but by the same careful restraint instructor Marsh had demonstrated in that yard, a restraint earned through hard history rather than given freely. By the time morning came, the administration office confirmed that all 40 transfer requests from the days before had been formally approved, along with several new ones filed overnight, mine among them. Instructor Marsh's course roster for the following term had grown larger than any single elective in academy history, filled with cadets from nearly every species represented on campus, all of them drawn there by the same simple truth none of us could quite shake. She had caught a weapon meant to end a fight with nothing but one open hand, and by the time night fell over that quiet training yard, she had caught something far larger than a training staff. She had caught the full attention of an entire academy, and along with it, a new understanding of what humanity had been carrying quietly, all along, long before any of us ever arrived at this school to learn what strength was truly supposed to mean.